A paradox in the sky. Picture this. Alaska, a cold autumn day in 1942. Dozens of aircraft with shapes unfamiliar to the Soviet are lined up on the airfield. A long nose, but not with an engine, rather with a cannon, and a cockpit shifted far back, almost to the tail. These are the P-39 Airacobra fighters. They're being accepted by a Soviet military mission. The American instructors, handing over the machines, frown skeptically. Their words, translated through an interpreter, sound like a warning, almost a condolence. Be careful, guys. The machine is tricky, temperamental, goes into a spin easily, weak on the vertical. You can't catch Germans in it. Now, fast forward a few months. Kuban, spring of 1943. Furious, bloody battles for air superiority. A pack of Messerschmitts, confident in their superiority, closes in on the tail of a group of Soviet fighters. But what's this? The Soviet machines perform a maneuver unthinkable for the German pilots. A tight turn at low altitude. The Messer formation breaks apart, and one of the clumsy machines, as it was called in the West, pauses for a moment in a burst from its powerful cannon. One shot is enough. The Messerschmitt is pierced through. It disintegrates in midair. This is not just a victory. It's a triumph. And the name of the triumphator is the same, Airacobra. How can this be? How did an aircraft that the Allies, the Americans, and the British deemed defective, unsuitable for real war, become the terror of the Luftwaffe and the favorite of Soviet aces? This paradox, my friends, holds the essence of the story. This is not a tale about a good or a bad plane. This is a story about context, about how a weapon, useless in some hands and under some conditions, turns into a legend in others. This is a story about war, about people, about the genius of adaptability, and about how the truth always lies somewhere in the middle. Allow me, as someone who has long studied this topic, to guide you through all the labyrinths of this enigma. We won't just list the reasons. We will delve into the history of the Airacobra's creation, the economics of Lend-Lease, the tactics of air combat on the eastern and western fronts, and, most importantly, into the minds of Soviet and American pilots. Ready? Let's go. The ugly duckling from overseas, conception and disappointment. To understand the phenomenon of the Airacobra in the USSR, we must first understand why it was rejected in the West. And for that, we need to go back to the late 30s, to the design bureau of the Bell Aircraft Company. A revolution that didn't take root. The birth of the P-39. The idea behind the P-39 was, without exaggeration, revolutionary. The chief designer, Robert Woods, proposed a layout that went against the classic design. While most fighters had the engine in the front, in a long nose, Woods decided to move it to the center of the fuselage, behind the pilot's back. And what was in the nose? There, they placed a heavy 37mm M4 aircraft cannon, firing through the hollow propeller shaft. This was the central, fixed idea, to create a fighter built around a supremely powerful weapon. What advantages did this configuration promise? Excellent visibility. The long nose obstructing the view was gone. The pilot gained superb all-around visibility, especially forward and downward. Concentrated firepower, all heavy armament, the cannon and machine guns, was concentrated in the nose, providing colossal fire density. The projectiles flew on a single trajectory, not requiring complex aiming corrections. Flight stability. The center of mass shifted towards the center of the fuselage, which theoretically should have made the plane a more stable firing platform. But, as is often the case with revolutionary ideas, the devil was in the details. To transmit torque from the centrally located engine to the propeller in the nose, engineers used a long shaft that ran under the pilot's cockpit. This added weight, complexity, and created a host of technical problems. The main Achilles heel, however, became the tricycle landing gear. At the time, this was a novelty. For American and British pilots accustomed to tail-dragger landing gear, this became a source of constant trouble during takeoff and landing. The plane was prone to wheelbarrowing, dangerous bouncing, a flying coffin for the Allies. Why they rejected it? The very first combat sorties of Airacobras with the British Royal Air Force ended in disaster. The British, fighting in the skies of Europe, encountered realities that the U.S. designers simply could not have foreseen. The high-altitude front. The war in the West was, first and foremost, a war at high altitudes. Luftwaffe bombers flew at altitudes of 6 to 7,000 meters, and they had to be intercepted there. And the Airacobra had one fatal flaw: the lack of a turbo supercharger. This is a device that forces air into the engine at high altitude where the air is thin. Without it, the Airacobra's engine at altitudes above 4 to 5,000 meters began to suffocate. Power dropped catastrophically. It simply couldn't catch up with either the German bombers or, especially, the escort fighters. Tactics and psychology. American and British pilots were raised on a certain doctrine. A fighter is about speed and altitude. Boom and zoom. The P-39 didn't offer them that. It wasn't fast in the vertical. Its element was horizontal maneuver, a turning fight. But who would engage in such a fight when the enemy had a Messerschmitt Bf 109, which held the energy advantage? Temperamental handling. The rear-shifted center of gravity made the plane very sensitive to control inputs. It truly easily fell into a flat spin, recovery from which required great skill and coolness. For a young pilot fresh out of flight school, this often became a death sentence. Here's a vivid example. One of the first British pilots to test the Airacobra said after landing, "You can only fly this thing slowly and low in circles to scare crows." It was a verdict. The contract was terminated. The U.S. Army Air Forces, which had the more promising P-51 Mustang and P-47 Thunderbolt in service, also weren't eager to adopt the failure. And here comes the most interesting plot twist. The U.S. had accumulated hundreds of unwanted, rejected aircraft. And on the other side of the world, a war was raging where an ally desperately needed any reinforcements. And these planes found their consumer. Lend-Lease deliveries. Economics versus ideology. Before we move to the Eastern Front, we need to make a crucial historical and economic digression. Without understanding Lend-Lease, the picture will be incomplete. What was Lend-Lease? Not a sale, but a lease. Many still believe that the Allies simply sold us equipment. That's not true. The Lend-Lease Act, from English lend, to give temporarily, and lease, to rent, passed in the U.S. in March 1941, was a brilliant economic and political tool. Its essence was formulated by Roosevelt simply. It's the same as if a neighbor's house was on fire, and I had a long hose. I wouldn't sell him the hose. I'd let him use it to put out the fire, and then he'd get it back to me. Under this law, the U.S. supplied its allies, Great Britain, the USSR, China, and others, with military equipment, ammunition, raw materials, and food. The recipient paid only for what remained with them after the war and could be used for peaceful purposes. Everything that was destroyed or used up during hostilities was not subject to payment. This was not an act of charity. It was a cold calculation. Every tank, every plane sent to the USSR meant that one Soviet soldier would be killing a German soldier, not an American one. It was a payment in blood. And in this logic, the Airacobra turned out to be an ideal hose. It was already produced, gathering dust in warehouses, and they just needed to get rid of it with maximum benefit. Alsib, the Sky Road of Life. Delivering the planes to the USSR was a separate heroic epic. The main route became the Alaska-Siberia, Alsib Airway. Soviet pilots accepted the Airacobras in Fairbanks, Alaska, and ferried them across the Bering Strait, Chukotka, Yakutia, Siberia to the front. This was a path of 6,500 kilometers, full of deadly dangers. The harshest climate, mountain ranges, lack of normal airfields, blind flights. Imagine these pilots. They climbed into the cockpit of an unfamiliar machine, reputed to be dangerous, labeled in an incomprehensible language, and flew it across the ends of the earth. Many crashed without ever reaching the front. It was a feat that is rarely talked about. But it was along this sky road of life that about half of all supplied Airacobras came to us, almost 2,500 machines. The meeting of two worlds, the Airacobra and the Red Army. And so, The moment of truth. Autumn 42, spring 43. The first Airacobras arrive at the front. What did the Soviet pilots see? Shock and awe. A view from the Soviet Ace's cockpit. Let's be honest. The first impression was mixed. Pilots accustomed to the austere, simple to fly, but often inferior yaks and lags, looked at the Airacobra as a curiosity. Comfort. Compared to Soviet machines, it was a Lexus. A spacious cockpit with a closing canopy. On many of our fighters early in the war, canopies were sliding or absent altogether. A comfortable seat, excellent glazing. The pilot felt not as if in a cramped coffin cockpit, but in a working office. Instruments. The quantity and quality of flight and navigation instruments were enviable. We didn't have such an abundance. And the main thing, the radio, this was perhaps the biggest shock. The Airacobra had a full-fledged radio station, and not just a receiver, but a transmitter. In the Red Army at the start of the war, radios were only available to squadron commanders, and even those often worked intermittently. Wingmen often flew without communication, just watching the leader's maneuvers. But here, every pilot could talk. This changed tactics dramatically. It became possible to coordinate actions in battle, warn of danger, and vector each other onto targets. But there was also a shock of a different kind. The plane was indeed demanding. It did not forgive mistakes. But here we come to the most important point. Why did complexity become an advantage? The phenomenon of the Soviet pilot. And now, friends, let's dispel one myth. The myth that Soviet pilots were some kind of supermen who could tame any machine. No, it was simpler and, if you think about it, more tragic. By 1943, those who remained in the ranks were mostly those who had gone through the hell of 1941 and 42. These were not yesterday's cadets, but battle-hardened, experienced veterans. They had already passed the survival school on the most difficult machines. And here is the key point. For them, the Airacobra wasn't complex. For them, it was logical. Let's recall what was said in the original text. Many future Cobra Aces started the war on the MiG-3. And the MiG-3 was a high-altitude interceptor with the same vices, a shifted center of gravity and a tendency to spin. A pilot who had mastered the MiG, for whom spin recovery was a skill honed to automaticity, sitting in the Airacobra, felt at home. Its behavior was familiar to him. What was a deadly trap for an American novice was a known handling characteristic for a Soviet veteran, which he knew how to use. It wasn't that we were geniuses. It was that we had been through a school after which handling the Airacobra didn't seem something extreme. We had already learned to fly on what was available. And when something better appeared, we simply applied that experience. The tactical niche, find your sky. This is perhaps the most important chapter, because it explains everything. The success or failure of a weapon is determined not by its abstract performance characteristics, but by how well those characteristics match the theater of war. The Eastern Front, the war near the ground. Forget the stereotypes of Hollywood movies where fighters duel in clear skies at 8,000 meters. The Eastern Front was a different war. It was the War of Irons, the IL-2 Sturmovik ground attack aircraft, which operated at altitudes from 100 to 1,000 meters. It was a war for dominance over the battlefield, where the main targets were not strategic bombers, but Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers, transport planes, reconnaissance aircraft, and, most importantly, ground troops. The bulk of air combat occurred at altitudes between 1,000 and 4,000 meters. And what a coincidence! It was at these altitudes that the Airacobra's engine, devoid of a turbo supercharger, operated at its maximum power. The very drawback that killed it in the West became its trump card here, in the East. At low and medium altitudes, the Airacobra wasn't just good. It was magnificent. Speed. It could achieve speeds near the ground and up to 4,000 meters that were comparable to, and often exceeded, those of early model Bf-109s. Maneuverability. Thanks to its weight distribution, it was excellent in turns. It could turn inside a messer, getting on its tail. Rate of climb. At medium altitudes, its climb rate was more than respectable. The Germans, accustomed to the fighting style of Yaks and Lavochkins, which preferred vertical maneuvers, encountered new tactics. The Airacobra dragged them into horizontal fights, where it had the advantage. This was a tactical surprise that cost many German aces their lives. The psychological factor, the element of surprise. Put yourself in the place of a German pilot. You see a group of fighters. You identify them by silhouette, yaks. You know their weaknesses and strengths. You know how to fight them. Then you get closer, and they aren't yaks. There's something else. A long nose, a cockpit at the back. What is that? While you're figuring it out, restructuring your tactics in your head, you've already lost. You lose precious seconds. And in an air battle, a second is an eternity. The Airacobra was for the Luftwaffe the same kind of surprise as the Jet Me 262 later was for us. Until a counter tactic is developed, a new machine has a colossal advantage. Golden hands and one trigger, the genius of Soviet adaptation. Now let's talk about what has always distinguished our people: ingenuity and the ability to refine even what seems beyond improvement. The engineering touch, Soviet mechanics and technicians. If Soviet pilots were aces in the sky, then Soviet technicians and mechanics were aces on the ground. These people, working in conditions of wild scarcity of spare parts, in the open air, in frost and mud, possessed truly golden hands. They didn't just repair planes. They improved them. What did they do with the Airacobra? Engine tuning. They increased the permitted engine RPM and temperature. Yes, this reduced its service life from the designated 400 hours to maybe 150. But ask any pilot, what's better, to fly 150 hours in a fast machine or 400 hours in a slow one, risking being shot down in the first engagement? The answer is obvious. At the front, planes didn't live long. A 400-hour resource was simply not in demand. Weight reduction. They removed some of the armor plates protecting the engine from the rear. Why? To shift the center of gravity forward. This was a genius solution that partially compensated for the machine's main design flaw. The plane became less demanding, more obedient. Yes, the pilot was slightly more vulnerable from the rear, but he got a more controllable weapon. It was a calculated risk they took consciously. All firepower on one trigger, a tactical know-how. A separate story is the armament. The 37mm M4 cannon was a monstrous weapon. Its projectile weighed over 600 grams. A hit from one such shell into any enemy aircraft was equivalent to a death sentence. It tore them to pieces. The ammunition load was small, only 30 rounds. But a true ace doesn't need many. Alexander Pokryshkin, our legendary pilot, tactical genius, came up with a brilliant idea. He ordered the technicians to link all of the Airacobra's armament, the cannon, the 2 heavy machine guns, and the 4 regular ones, to a single trigger. Imagine the wall of fire that fell upon the enemy with the press of one button. This wasn't just fire. It was a wall of lead and explosions. The tracer rounds from the machine guns allowed for aiming, and then the heavy cannon, which finished the target, came into play. It was stunningly effective. The Germans simply didn't understand what was happening. Legends in the cockpit: Pokryshkin, Rechkolov, and others. Hardware is nothing without the man. And the Airacobra became the aircraft on which the talent of the greatest Soviet aces blossomed. Alexander Pokryshkin. He didn't just fight. He thought. He developed tactics. His famous formula, altitude, speed, maneuver, fire, perfectly fit the Airacobra's capabilities. He perfected group combat using its radio equipment. Pokryshkin proved that the Airacobra was not just a fighter, it was a command post in the air. More than half of his victories were achieved on it. Grigory Rechkolov. This was a killer pilot, a virtuoso of aerial gunnery. His record, 19 shot down in 2 weeks, speaks for itself. He used the power of the Airacobra to the fullest, preferring short, devastating attacks. These men were not afraid of the machine. They understood it, accepted its shortcomings, and learned to use its advantages 100%. They became one with it. So who are you, Airacobra? So what is the answer to the main question? Why was it the worst for the Allies and the best for us? The answer is complex and simple at the same time. There is no bad or good weapon in a vacuum. There is a weapon that either fits or doesn't fit the specific conditions, tactics, and level of training of the personnel. The Airacobra was a specialist aircraft. It was created for one role: a low-altitude interceptor and air superiority fighter. In the West, it had no place because the war there was different. They tried to use it for purposes it wasn't intended for, and it failed. On the Eastern Front, it found its element. In the hands of experienced, battle-hardened pilots who already knew how to deal with its flaws. In conditions where its high-altitude weakness didn't matter, and its maneuverability and firepower became decisive factors. It was complemented by genius technicians and innovative tacticians. The Airacobra for the USSR is not just an airplane. It is a symbol that even in the most difficult circumstances, even with what you are given, even with what others have deemed effective, you can work miracles, provided you have the mind, the will, the ingenuity, and the courage. This is a story about how true strength lies not in the perfect tool, but in the ability to use the one you have. And that, my friends, is a lesson relevant for all times. So, our story about the steel predator with the soul of a paradox comes to an end. I hope I managed not just to retell the facts, but to convey to you that very solution hidden in the details. And now I really want to hear your opinion. What do you think? Was the Airacobra truly a great aircraft, or do we simply have nothing else to choose from? Maybe I missed something? Be sure to write in the comments. Let's discuss. Your opinion is extremely important to me. And if this story gripped you, if you want to continue unraveling such historical puzzles with me, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. It's the best support for me and a signal that I need to prepare new material for you. Thank you for staying with us until the end. Until we meet again on the air.